Let's check in on Facebook here. Great. If you're here with me on Facebook, I'll actually see what you comment. So welcome your questions and comments as we take a look at the great C major fugue. And in my email to you, I called it Fugue and Friends, because I do want to take a bit of a look as well, just to get started, to get acquainted, reacquainted, maybe with the third and fourth movements. They're so beautiful, and I don't want to cram everything about those two movements into Friday's hour only. So great to see you here, and there's Donald in Victoria, BC, Michael in NYC, and I'm in the UK, or at least Bach was in the UK. This is just one part of the enormous St. Paul's Cathedral. I believe this is the choir area, and Bach would have been very, very familiar with that area of not this cathedral, but others that he worked and performed in. And the reason for that is, if you listen to the fugue subject, I believe it was our friend Paula who pointed out last time how much it sounds like. So rather than put us in front of London Bridge, I at least wanted a roof over our heads here. So thanks as always for joining me. Great to see you. And yeah, happy Earth Day. A strange one for sure. And if I believe one or both of my parents may be here with us today too, and they were part of the festivities of the very first Earth Day back in Madison, Wisconsin, where they were in school. So there's some footage somewhere of them playing flute duets as part of the very first Earth Day. So I suppose 50 years ago. Great. Well, let's go ahead and get started. There's a lot to look at, almost too much. I will play the whole fugue through before we move on to the third and fourth movements, because I think it's important to get a sense of just the massive architecture of this. Perhaps we're in a good place for that. Important to get a sense of that. So before that happens, I want to look at a few specific places. Luckily, we've gotten to look at a couple fugues already, the G minor and the A minor. So there's not a lot conceptually new here. There's just more of it. And if you've played this one, or when you do play it through, you'll notice there are just a lot more four-note chords, a ton of four-note chords. And every time you add a string, you almost double the difficulty as far as intonation and getting around. Because four strings, one of them might be open, two of them might be open, but you're probably putting down three, if not all four fingers. And when you're having then to switch from four notes, boom, another four notes, to three note, to four note, it's just a lot of info to process. Not to mention, you don't want to just play the notes, but you'd like your listeners to hear the voice, the interesting voice, the one that's moving. So the bow not only needs to navigate those strings cleanly and with a beautiful sound and all that, but to finish on the string with the interesting voice. So last time we looked at the subject and the counter subject. So after the first voice's entrance with the subject, I'm speeding it up. And like in so many fugues for all kinds of instruments, Bach changes the interval. So instead of, he's got to start on a C. And instead of, he raises that interval of either minor second or major second. That gets to be a major headache when you're trying to memorize this movement, because sometimes it's raised, sometimes it's not, and you've got to keep those straight. We'll talk as well about memory in here too. But while the second voice is doing its thing, the first voice plays a counter subject. So little ligament, a little connective tissue here. And then for the third voice, we suddenly have four-note chords. In the other fugues, when the third voice comes in, we're only at three voices, but now we've got four notes at once, and the second to top voice does the counter subject. Amazing how he can fit that in. And then an extension. And now the top voice has the counter subject. That's already a lot in the first few lines. It's just three entrances of the subject with a little extension. And now an episode. You've got to use these for levity or lightness. Maybe levity is the wrong word, but you have to give some relief to your listeners' ears and to yourself physically. It's going to be a long hike, this. So, rather than you're really punching those out, I want to make them as light as I can, considering the subject matter. So going toward the dissonance and away from the resolution. And some of you have asked from time to time, how do you know what to go toward, what to phrase to? And there might not be a right or a wrong answer, but a nice rule of thumb certainly is going toward dissonance, bringing it out, relaxing into resolutions, except when you've got a major checkpoint, like when we finally, this is a fugue in C major, even though the first note's on G. If we get to a big moment of a 5 chord, a G chord, end of a section, I'll go toward that resolution. I'm not going to shy away from that one. And then some of you have also asked, okay, that's great to go toward a dissonance. How do you know what's a dissonance? Let's at least define it. So you could call them dissonant chords or intervals, or just unstable ones that need to resolve somewhere. So if I play that's not an ending, right? A tritone is the most unstable of all intervals. It has to resolve. Similarly, that's no kind of ending. That at least, you could call that an ending. Be kind of a wimpy ending, but at least you could end on that. So the kind of interval it is. Perfect fourths, actually, even though that's technically a perfect interval, it's still considered unstable. Usually needs to resolve down. So with practice and experience, recognizing those becomes second nature. But I will say you shouldn't just rely on that experience. I'm as liable as the next person to get caught up in some technical considerations and just land right on an interval that if I'd thought about it for another second, I might want to relax away from. So let me see what you have to say about all this here. Becky says not much going on in Madison, Wisconsin. Since I mentioned the first Earth Day there. Northern Ireland. Awesome. Well, this is the closest yet we've gotten to you here. I like that. Fugue Wednesday. That's a good. That should be the national holiday. Forget this Earth Day business. Good. So going on from, this is a very short episode, and then it gets right back to the dense stuff. One of these famous places, the fugue subject in the bottom voice, I'd like to play 3 notes at once and just end on the bottom one. And as a reminder, what I'm doing there, I'm putting my arm on the level of the middle string, which in this case is that D string. I'm out away from the bridge. If I want any chance at playing 3 notes at once, I've got to go where the strings are a little closer to each other, a little away from the bridge. Quite, healthy and steady pressure on the strings, but there's no rolling. None of that. It's just a straight stroke. Only until the end, when I want to end up on the G string, do I roll it over to the G. Again, call this an interlude or an episode, but take advantage of the chance to and if you like, you can differentiate the top and the bottom voices with a little difference in length maybe, or a little difference in volume. If I play the top voice a little shorter and lighter, good. This gives way to a little further playing around. Finally, we've got some steady 8th notes, but still light. And look what the accompanying voice is doing. It's doing the opposite of the counter subject from so. Here's a place where the interesting voice jumps all over, so your arm needs to be ready in advance to know which voice it's going to end on. Here's a famous thorny place. We talked last time about how I choose not to roll these backwards from top to bottom, but always from bottom to top, and just trust you to put together the bass line. And finally, we know where that chord's got to resolve. It just takes a few extra bars. Surprise. So that's an example of a resolution that I would go boldly toward. We've gone from starting on the note G, but now finishing on a big C major chord. And now there's quite an extended and lighter section. And whenever you've got those, not only do you want to take the opportunity to lighten things up, but be always on the lookout for series. There are a few different common kinds of series: ascending, descending. Obviously that would be an ascending series. Descending, easy enough to figure out. And commonly I might crescendo through an ascending series, which means that I make sure to come down for the start of it. Might do the opposite for the descending ones, and rather than thinking, oh, that's just so obvious, I've got to come up with something more creative than that, Maybe, but start at least with that. Do something. Because chances are, especially for people who don't know the piece backward and forward, that's going to be really satisfying for them. You're leading them through it. Another kind of series might be descending fifths. We'll probably catch some of those in this movement. But on the violin, sometimes those can be tricky to spot because the octaves might jump around. So the basic idea is you might have chords that go but maybe the octaves will be switched around, so it would be like in any case you can recognize it as descending fifths. A lot of times those sort of series are more interesting to alternate because they're more of a vertical series. They're based more on chords than on the melody. And so you might have in another context, depending on the harmony, it might be. So be on the lookout for those in those interlude sections where it's a little bit less dense chord-wise. And I see some comments and questions. Lisa, you ask about a note being implied. So what I mean by that is, let's say, and I forget the exact context in which it came up on Monday, but let's say that we had a bass line that went like. So we had, and then the last chord. So that's kind of a poor example because that's not a very well written chord, 6/4, I think. But clearly it's a C chord. So even if literally the lowest notes would be these, that last chord is still a C major chord. And so that would be the implied bass line. And it can be, that's the sort of thing that different people might see different ways. Bach's actual bass lines are so great, he usually doesn't need that much implied. But there are times where, because of the limitations of the instrument, he'll write things in a way that maybe sound better or more satisfying on the violin, but that don't fulfill all the requirements of a strict bass line. And so in that case, we give him a little license because he's writing for the violin and not the keyboard. And so we might say, here's a slightly better bass line that he implied. And so that's how I think of those. And Robert, you mentioned this fugue being or the entire sonata being a requirement at the Hanover competition back in the day. And yeah, this can, if everybody's got to play this, then that's level playing field. I don't know that I would choose to play this one in competition if I didn't have to. Mainly for this movement. It's just, it's a task and a half. Good, let me see if there are other questions. Now, Juan, you mentioned doing one on the 6 assai sonatas. I don't know how up I am for performing all those live for you, but it's certainly an interesting and a worthy idea, and maybe I could get to know those better than I do. Practice question, and this would be a great time actually to talk about some practice issues in this movement. But Henry, your particular question, how do you go about learning a particular passage with many consecutive chords? Well, that's actually what I was going to talk about. The aim being consistency. Yeah. Here's the biggest thing to remember. By far, the majority of people bite off more than they can chew in any given practice session with a movement like this. It's all about where you're starting from and how far you're trying to go in a particular session. Slow and steady is the way to get through these and to build that consistency. And the way to avoid frustration, at least as much as possible. You're going to be frustrated playing this movement at some point. It's going to happen because it's very difficult. But each individual difficulty doesn't have to add up to, these giant mountains. What you need is to break it down and see where the actual problems are, not to go too fast, and not to bite off more than you can chew at one point. So let's skip past this long episode. So if we're looking at bar numbers, this finishes at 92 in E major. And now we enter an area of two voices. That's not going to give everyone too many fits. And now here comes a dense part. So if I'm practicing this, I'm probably not going to be able to play all those chords consecutively, even at that tempo, when I'm just starting out. Why would I just be able to do that? So I'm going to break it down into little nuggets. So middle of 98. Maybe just getting from one 3-note chord to the next. And here's where you've got to, listen to your body and always keep an ear on your sound, of course. How difficult is that? Do I feel confident, or am I having to search for fingers? That feeling, too many players have just come to accept that the norm is to kind of scramble for a chord at the very last minute, to search for the right place. I would really urge you to practice so that that feeling is the exception rather than the norm, because there's just no way you can get through a movement like this with uncertain fingers. So while I'm playing, are my 3 and 4 already finding their place? If not, and I'm putting them down like that, then I'm not really ready to go on. And this requires a little bit of pride swallowing for some people. Even if you don't say it out loud, you might be thinking, but come on, this is so slow already. I should be able to do this. How much simpler can I make this? Make it simpler so that it feels easy to do the task that you're trying to do. What usually happens is that you practice based on what you think you should be doing or should be able to do. And so you'll kind of accept that feels scrambly. A mistake will happen shortly. And you fix that one and you go on, and what you've left behind you is, a patchwork, a bridge that's held together by duct tape, right? Instead, you want to put stones nice and strong right next to each other with no gaps. So once I've got, and that's feeling good, maybe I'll go from, and I'm using the music, by the way. I'm reading ahead a little bit in the music so that I can help my fingers know where to go next. Again, I want that easy feeling in both hands. And in 1 minute, I've only gone 1 bar? That's fine. This whole thing only has a few hundred bars. So, it's not like we're looking at thousands and thousands. If I work, and it's only in these very dense sections that I would need to work that way. So from 4 beats, maybe 3 3-note chords in a row, I can expand that to 8 beats, etc. But I have to build it like that. I have to let my hands have confidence from the very beginning. One other thing I will say, corrections. When I play this whole thing through, I'm going to play some wrong chords. I will guarantee you that. If I don't, then I'm going to buy a lottery ticket right afterward, because it's the luckiest day of my life. In practice, when you play a note that's wrong, rather than the first instinct, and throwing the hands off the instrument and open strings, whatever. Figure out what it was that you did. Okay. I put down a 2 instead of a 1. Lift and replace. And then get to that chord again. And then you might start to notice, there's a reason it's a B flat rather than a C. The accompanying voices are going. That doesn't mean in performance that I'll necessarily be listening to that accompanying voice, but the fact that I've planted the idea, it's in there, may just save me sometime when it counts. I may pick up on that and hear. So I like practicing with the music for a good long while so that I can see the things that I might not yet be hearing. The no shoulder rest thing is probably too big a topic for right here and now. But just very briefly, the biggest difference playing without a shoulder rest is that you have to support the instrument with the left hand or the left arm 99% of the time. Whereas with a shoulder rest, you have options. You can still support with the hand all the time if you like, or you can use the weight of the head against the leverage of the shoulder rest to help support the instrument. That's really not an option when you don't use a rest, so you must figure out how to get around while still supporting with the left hand. Seems counterintuitive. Why would you want to have to support the instrument with the left hand while at the same time doing all the things that the left hand does? I can tell you that for me, I have enjoyed the closer connection I feel between the left hand and the instrument. I'm never allowed to just act upon the instrument with the left hand. It always has to be part of the hand. For me, that's meant greater consistency, a slightly different kind of vibrato and sound, and I've enjoyed it very much. But in my teaching, I never insist or even very strongly encourage that somebody give up a shoulder rest. But that's the brief version of that. And now a question about measure 96. How do I solve the B flat and F chord? So 96 is, right. So here's the problem. We've got an accompanying voice that includes a fifth. I'm in third position, so I place the 3. When I place this chord, my 3 is, all the fleshy part is on the A string, so you can see how close it is already to the D string. So a very small roll of the hand will allow part of the 3 to touch the D string. Especially if I do it not gradually, but with a little decision. Some people prefer to wrap a 4th finger around there. For me, that's a lot more difficult, so I don't do that. Great. I'm getting close to when I'm going to have to play this for you, so I can stall a little bit more. I do want to look at these amazing sections. I've mentioned that most of the time, the 8th note sections are a little bit lighter in character, but there are 2 of these that lead to big climaxes instead. And they come out of normal episodic stuff. It's still you can hear it's based on the fugue subject, right? So this section, and by the way, almost everybody hooks something so that you end up bow on these chords. Of course, that's the fugue subject again. The reason to be up bow is that it follows the curve of the bridge and the shape of the bow arm a little better, rather than doing descending string crossings after a down bow. It works a little better the other way. So and as you can hear, I'm letting off the longer voice to let the eighth note sound more. Rather than so the first of these puts us solidly in G, just as I said it would in the beginning. This is the main climax of the movement. From C to G, of course, we'll end up back in C, but bunch of time there, take time. And then al riverso, says right there in this score, turns the fugue subject upside down. I love it. And yeah, drama ensues. We'll say that. The wrap-up of the movement is not quite as long as all this build-up. There's another long eighth note episode that leads into the same kind of... And this one also actually, instead of putting us in C right away, it's a G chord. But because of what happens right before, that one still seems like it has somewhere to go, namely. And so the whole rest of the movement is mostly a recap of the first couple minutes. It's almost identical. And then it ends. It's almost like so much has happened in this movement anyway, it would be superfluous to write more material to end it. I'm just going to recap the beginning and be done with it. So that at least makes this slightly easier to memorize. So if anybody hates Bach fugues, you're probably not here, but if you do, you can set your timer for 10 minutes and come back. Yeah, this will be the C major fugue, and we'll see what's the state of my open strings by the time I finish. All right. I'm not going to jump in and do that again. I forgot to mention the very last chord. Well, let's see how the open strings are. All right. So, yeah, go back and we'll just auto-tune all those. The very last chord, what notes do you hold? We've got... Usually you hold the top two, right? Something like that. In this case, I hold the middle two because of the chord right before needs to resolve. They're all written as half notes. I can only really hold two of them, or I could choose to just hold one. But so in this case, I hold the middle two. It's also a little nicer not to have to finish on a fifth, in case that's getting a little squirrely. Let me see what I forgot to mention before I played. Oh, Paula, you're exhausted. That's it's funny that's often the response you get when you play this. Your audience feels like they've gone, 12 rounds. And Charlotte, you asked, had I learned all of these previously, or did I have to learn some movements especially for this? And I really appreciate your words about this. And this will stick around for anybody who wants to see it after the fact, for sure. I have performed all of this solo Bach at least once before, but as I said in week 2, the B minor, that was the one that I've performed the least. So I didn't learn any movements specifically for this, but those are the ones where I had the most homework to do. And you always wonder, that can be an advantage, of course. Of course, it's an advantage having played something before. But especially the ones you learn when you're a kid or youngish, or we'll say emotionally immature, you can get stuck in some ways of playing, frankly, some boring ways of playing. When you weren't forced to think about how you wanted things to go. And so often the ones you know the best are the ones you have to actively, you have to work against those old habits. Hopefully they're good technical habits, but probably the musical habits were somewhat immature and there's room for growth there. Whereas the ones you learn now, right from the get-go, you're seeing characters and lines, sentences and phrases everywhere. And then physical tension in this. There's nothing. Once it gets in a movement like this, there's very little you can do to get rid of it. So it's really all about prevention. Most of that groundwork you lay in practice, obviously. The lightest necessary fingers. I have that video, finding your MVP, minimum violin pressure, setting that as a goal, as a habit all the time. Similar thoughts for the right arm, especially in a movement like this. Horizontal whenever you can rather than vertical. That does wonders for the music too, because then you're not locked into that bound, which is the worst quality of this movement if it's played that way. And you almost have to have, of course, you as I say, you lay the groundwork for that in practice. In performance, you almost have to relearn it because, of course, there can be a tendency in performance to be a little tighter, to hold on a little stronger, press a little harder. And so you have to get used to stepping out and finding that balance with the instrument again. It's never going to feel exactly the same as it does in the practice room, but if you're always practicing with an eventual audience in mind, with a musical direction in mind, then that stage feels a whole lot closer to the practice room experience because you've brought the practice room experience that much closer to the stage. So I didn't specifically mention it today, but we've talked about it in some prior sessions. Just the overall body setup. If here I'm seated because of the needs of the camera and all that. But if I were standing, I'd want my weight to be right over my heels, basically, kind of sitting back on the heels, the longest possible spine. That I want even when I'm sitting. I want my head generally like this rather than down and forward. So like this. The widest possible chest. You play with the hand you're dealt, I suppose, but rather than anything like this, shoulders in, you want it back and down. With the violin, we got to compromise a little bit, right? We can't have both shoulders down and back all the time, because unless you've got the world's longest arms, it's not going to reach. So often you'll see me kind of shift things around. The left shoulder maybe down and back as much as possible, and the right comes around to have a good position. Then I might shift for a while. The instrument may come a little more in front of me, the right arm moves along with it. So as long as you have some of that freedom, then you can at least keep things moving, because the static positions really invite tension to come in. Talked a little about playing without a shoulder rest. If you do that, gotta watch for that shoulder coming up and staying up. That's a killer. Whether you use a shoulder rest or not, the head leaning down and staying there, another killer. You don't want to compress any of these nerves there. So those are all things that will leave you healthier in general, and certainly, much better able to get through a piece like this. As far as learning this movement on the viola for the purposes of violin performance, I wonder, I haven't tried it myself. Everything would be a little bit more difficult, all the chords a little harder to grab, all the intervals a little wider. Violin might feel that much easier after it. Eventually you have to dial in all the differences, the contact points and the pressures and all that on your particular instrument. If you handed me a different one now, surely I'd be able to play the movement, but some chords wouldn't speak all that well. I wouldn't know that instrument as I know this one. Whoops. Turning the wrong peg. Let's just get a little 5-minute intro to the third and fourth movements here, and then we can dive into those on Friday. They're much less complex, and in fact, the third movement is really nothing more than a beautiful melody. It's one of the most song-like movements in all the 6 sonatas and partitas, with occasional accompaniment. It's written Largo, which is a very slow tempo marking, but it's still in 4. So I'm playing 16th notes. I do not want this to sound in 8. Even though it's often bowed in 8th notes. So I've got to pick my tempo and my articulations to transcend that, to play this in 4. From F to C there, and stop. This bowing invites, it has a lot of slurs in the manuscript, but it also invites other places that I think are appropriate for slurring. This is not a movement where I change the bowings quite a lot in this one. I mean, I do keep the slurs that are there, but sometimes I also add others. So it's a beautiful and fun movement to play, even though obviously you want to make the accompaniment as seamless as possible. You get going playing the melody, and then all of a sudden you've got to reach down for another string. You don't want it to sound too jarring. And then finally, the last movement is another one of these, barn burning. And this one really just has all 16th notes. The A minor last movement had the... Here, we just have 16th notes, and so the 16ths can be quite fast. C major is not the easiest key to play in, actually, on the violin, even though no sharps and no flats. It's a lot of first position, a lot of big spaces between 2, 3, and 4, both on the A string, well, E, A, and D strings. To open up the space here at the bass joints, rather than having the fingers stuck together and trying to reach for them, that's a bad position. Much better is having the space opened up. See, without moving the fingers on the strings, I can either have them stuck together or nicely spaced, and that all comes from opening the spaces there. So... I told you how fast the 16ths could be, and my hand said, not that fast. I'll see if I give a little more cohesive reading of the whole movement on Friday, as well as the third, but we'll talk a lot about string crossings, bowing patterns in this last movement. A lot of convenience bowings that I added in the version you just heard, and most people add, so that you're not doing a lot of bow. The direction of the bow makes a difference in how easy it is to execute in all these patterns. So you can choose to help yourself out in that way, or to work against it in some cases if you want more clarity, less ease. So those are the kind of things we'll talk about on Friday. So I hope you come back. Hope you come back, tell your friends, tell them how much they missed on Fugue Wednesday, and yeah, really appreciate you being here. And we will definitely get into the third and fourth movement. And we've said goodbye to the Fugue. Sorry. So yeah, Largo and Allegro assai on Friday, same time, 2 Pacific. Thanks so much.